I'm a cool anime guy. 2 swords.
In fantasy, we often see examples of characters using 2 large weapons, and this just really isn't realistic for a number of reasons. There are multiple examples of dual wielding throughout history, but they're almost invariably shorter weapons. And that's because, well, once it gets this long, the length becomes a real problem.
Or thrusting only.
Thrusting only. There are examples of prominently thrusting weapons being done, 2 longer weapons, because you don't have to worry quite as much about getting tangled up in the cut, but generally, people like to stick with 1 longer weapon, sometimes a long and a short weapon. People usually bring up examples like Miyamoto Musashi, who talks about using 2 weapons, but if you actually read what he's writing, he's talking about a katana, which is already a shorter sword. A katana is much shorter than a longsword, and realistically was a 1-handed or 2-handed weapon, depending on what you were doing. And his secondary weapon is a wakizashi, which is a 1-handed, slightly longer than a dagger weapon. So realistically, he's talking about something more like rapier and dagger than he is 2 long swords.
Or if anything, more akin to Kali.
Yeah, like Kali, yeah.
It's so
honestly, it very much is. So, and another example, Kali. Kali sticks are quite short. You know what? Actually, hold this. Zoro style. Don't. So this is an example of a short Filipino weapon. You can see that it is considerably shorter than the longsword, and these would be used dual wielding, but they're not long enough to get in the way of the other one. You can easily maneuver them around. You can parry and then riposte. You can attack in 2 lines if you wanted to, but with these weapons, when we start using 2, you'll notice, even though these are of different lengths, it becomes a lot harder. I can't really get around myself quite as easily. They're heavier, and you'll notice that 2-handed weapons, specifically like these longswords. So longswords technically are, historically would have probably been 1.5-hand weapons. You could use a longsword and a shield, but a shield's very different than a secondary weapon. A shield's very different than using 1 sword and another sword. A shield can sit in front of you and stay there while this sword thrusts around and pokes or cuts and does stuff. It's not really getting in the way so much, and it's a passive defense. This has to be an active defense, which means it has to move around your body and defend different lines of attack. And when you've got another sword that's trying to attack around it, it becomes a really problematic situation. Additionally, like I said before, some of the best parts of 2-handed swords are the leverage you get and the maneuverability you get from having 2 hands on it and being able to do cool stuff. You immediately lose all of that when you go to 1 hand. It's heavy, it's hard to maneuver around, and you're clanking against each other. So yeah, it's not really something that you see in history for a reason.
A big thing also is, even if he had 2 swords and I had 1, this wouldn't be a fun fight, but also this would be so much quicker that in the Indez, I could probably, if you do 1 cut, I could probably
man, you know, do that again, and I want to show you something. I'm not exaggerating how far that took my sword over. I'm gonna try my hardest.
Yeah.
Do you know what just happened? So I'm gonna slow this down. He hit this sword, the pommel hit this sword and knocked it out of the way. So I was gonna try and stab you. And it got in my way, yeah? I might be able, now if I was gonna try and do this, my tactic could be throw this out here to get that and get that. That's valid, but you get to the point of, why?
Also, the best way I would counter this is just with range.
Yeah, range.
Out of range.
So if he knows I want to do that, right? Boom. Oh yeah, he got my hand. So we're gonna look at this really quick. If I've got 2 swords and he's got 1, he kind of knows what I want to do. Just by having 2 brain cells to rub together, he understands that I want to try and do 1 attack and then another attack. I want to defend an attack. I want to be able to get him so he's got his sword clogged up while he's the other one. So if I do this, and I've got this one coming, it's pretty easy. Just use your range, right?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I'm not really coming to you.
Right.
And he got my hand there, right? It's slow, it's annoying, and he knows what I'm gonna do. And now I'm treating these just like thrusting weapons because I can't cut with them.
Yeah.
If I try and cut.
Bomb. Bomb. Bomb.
Ah, my hands. Yeah.
It's just.
Granted, we don't have gear on.
Yeah.
We're gonna suit up and do this. This is just kind of an example. I know it's at slow speed.
I'm so much faster with just 1.
With just 1, he's so much faster. But no, we are gonna suit up and do this. But let's talk a little bit more about why it's not a good example. So if you look at the Kali stuff, a lot of it are these cuts that come like this, and they're attacking from multiple angles. They're block attack. This is incredible. I'm a strong guy. I'm a pretty strong guy.
He's ripped.
And this is difficult to control. These aren't super heavy, but they're heavy enough. Between 2.5 and 3.5 pounds.
Plus also, it's so much longer that it feels a lot heavier
because of the leverage.
Leverage.
Like I said, when these were used, so first off, when they were used with sword and, so if you go back to Fiore's day, when these were actually used on the battlefield, they weren't this long. They were about this long. They were much shorter. Longswords used to be much...
Like 35, 36 rather than...
That's when they were truly hand and a half war
inches.
weapons, and those would be used with a shield, and it'd be a lot easier to maneuver, so you can have your shield in front of you, and you can like go around the shield doing this kind of stuff, have the shield in front of you, but I have a passive defense that's always here. You must get around this, and while you're doing that, this is a big advantage.
Yeah.
If I have a passive defense that he has to get around, now I can go for other targets.
Yeah.
This is no longer a passive defense. If I just hold this here out in front of, he's got my hands all day. If I just hold this as a passive defense, it doesn't work. I have to actively engage this as an active defense and then try and work around my active defense. So you're making your life so much more complicated than if you were just using, now let's look at this, right? So I'm gonna drop one, now I've got one. And he tries to do anything. It's so much easier for me to deal with his sword when I have one that I can maneuver as quickly as his. I don't have to worry about my other sword being in the way.
We're more even.
We're more even.
The same amount of tempo.
So, 2 swords. It's not really a good idea, unless you're talking about shorter swords. There is one more example that we talked about a bit earlier, which is Rapier and dagger. That makes sense because again, you have an active defense, but that active defense is so much smaller, and in Rapier and dagger, primarily they're doing thrusting. There are cuts in Rapier, they absolutely do work. I wouldn't parry a cut with my dagger.
No, I wouldn't.
I wouldn't either. You can parry a cut with your Rapier or use distance. Best is distance. But the dagger is there to displace a thrust coming in.
A dagger is also great because it's usually used not as if you're going to get in close, you're not going to parry with the dagger. What's more likely is going to happen is you're going to use your 2 swords of equal length, cover, and a big sword I can't use right now.
Yeah.
A dagger I can stab you all day.
With the Rapier and dagger, and you see this also in Kali and Arnis and Silat, you see stick and knife. So the knife's not really there to parry the stick. Sometimes it's sword and knife, espada.
Yeah.
The knife's sometimes there to parry, but realistically what that knife is there for is if I get in close, I've got this knife to do whatever I want to with. It's with the more thrusting weapons, the knife is actually very good at moving the sword out of the way to come in. We'll show some fencing.
It's not blocking, it's winding and controlling and binding.
Winding and controlling and binding.
For binding, it's not great as a static defense.
Yeah, it's not a static defender.
I'm not just gonna, if he cuts, I'm just gonna
exactly. Because it's so because with that it's so easy to disengage and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
So if I have my 2 swords again, and I've got my static defense here, he can get under that so easy. And now I'm chasing his sword. You never want to be in a situation where you're chasing his sword. But let's say I had 2 of these and I was going to berserker you, right? So I'm just going to fling these both at. We're gonna have to save it for gear.
Well,
but like if I'm just like hammering you from both sides, it's not that hard for him to do both. Or if I'm cutting 2 at.
See, this is dangerous, but you'll
it's
always
dangerous
die.
For me.
Because we'll double it every time. Because if you're offending 2 lines, I have to choose one, but I can work indes and still stab you.
So this comes back to something we said before, which is if you absolutely are dead set on hitting your opponent. So if you are like, I will die to kill you.
Yeah.
It is so hard to fight that person because they're not gonna take any precautions and they will absolutely double you. So if I have 2 weapons and I don't care about surviving, then yeah, I could probably kill Clark. Easily. But if I care about surviving, then I'm probably in a bad situation.
Because even if you do attack both lines and I have to pick one, I'm right here.
Yeah, exactly.
You lost your defense.
I lost my defense, and even if I did hit your head with that, I didn't have any so power generation, again, right? Power generation comes from the chain of the body moving in unison with the thing. I'm coming from 2 different angles. The only power I have here are my arms and my pecs. These attacks have almost no power behind them because I have my chain of the body. We're talking about chain of the body again. The
kinetic chain.
The kinetic chain. I can only attack in one direction at one time because the chain of the body has to be. So if I'm attacking from this side, chain of the body there. If I'm attacking from this side, chain of the body there. If I'm attacking from both sides, I got my pecs and that's it. And there's not a lot of power behind that. So I'm throwing these two big slow cuts. You can pick. You can also back up, which is really nice. But even if you ate one of these, right? If you ate one of these with no power behind it, it would hurt. If I hit you in the head, it would be terrible.
Yeah.
But I'm probably in a worse situation.
Yeah. Not great. It's
not great.
Great for doubling.
Yeah, great for doubling. So like, if you want to be a berserker and die, get two things and go attack somebody and die. But if you want to be a good swordsman and not do that, then just pick one. Pick one. Now, because we're a channel that shows things, we're gonna go ahead and try and do this experiment with full fencing gear on and see how ridiculous it is.
Key location change.
Yeah, but like, I had to keep that one. Yeah, but it's not. Yeah. Yeah, but you got it for me. So once you commit. So you can double here. So try that and play over here. Yeah. Okay. Good talk. Yeah.
You got armed up.
Yeah, so you can double it, me. That's what you're doing. You're much better pencil than me. Yeah. You mind if I my fingers a little bit? Oh, now you're effective.
Yeah.
That's what's afraid of win the book.
I'm gonna let it drop it. I can die for it.
You got I built something down there? Was it a thrust or a cut?
Cut.
They had nothing on
My
it.
whole point was to like go high and low.
Yeah.
And I died for it.
Your cut had nothing on it.
I also didn't want to send it though.
Yeah. Well, do you think you put on that much?
Yeah.
Okay.
You basically like. I was doing like next week. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you got my hand though.
Yeah, you came. I think I caught it. You broke through, skidded on shoulder. Yeah.
A little bit back out your hand. I heard that.
Yeah. My garment. Yeah. What?
Now then figuring out you don't have any range.
No. I'll have to buy. Yeah.
Expensive because it's out of strength, but I have.
All right, so conclusions. So we tried this experiment where we fenced with 2 steel swords against 1 sword, and it was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So there's actually some interesting conclusions I think that we can draw from this. So first off, to talk about what we used. These are the Regenier Shorties. They are shorter fetters. They're still actually the size of a real sword. Depending on the time period, these might actually be considered long, but they're pretty thin. These are very light swords. They're still within the realm of what real swords would have weighed, so they're not fake, but they are on the very much lighter side. And we thought that was the only way we were going to give this any kind of a fair trial. I fenced with my Regenier standard, and you fenced with your Siggy standard, which is quite longer.
Yeah.
And so we had some mixed results. So first we should say Clark is a more experienced longsword fencer. He did have an edge going in either way.
A little bit, but once you figured it out, it increasingly didn't last very long.
So when I was using these two things, I alternated between trying to do kind of a rapier and dagger style parry and thrust, trying to bind and go, and then I switched to a little bit of Kali, trying to fight with two of these. All of those approaches felt terrible, and my arms started to get really tired. Look, I'm not the buffest guy ever, but I got some muscles on me. I got some muscles on me, and these were tough to swing around like that. I was lacking all of the structure that I wanted.
That was the big thing, is everyone always says, like, oh, it's great because you can attack and defend at the same time, but what we found was, in order to commit to this parry, to commit to this attack, I'd have to rotate my hips, and this would actively weaken, and then it'd blow through, and you'd hit me.
So the thing that, like he was saying, you can't make a very strong parry with one hand on a longsword. It gets blown through really easily. If it were a rapier, you'd have a little bit more luck because of the way that it's set up. But I think even then, it's just getting hit with a longsword, the one-handed weapon, trying to parry it. If you don't catch it in the cross, if you don't catch it with good structure, it's very difficult to stop it, especially when your structure's already messed up from having two of these weapons trying to use. And so when Clark did it, he found more initial success than I did.
I used it much more rather than having to two out to use one. It was much more, I had this one back and this one out. And
so you try to take my blade.
The moment, bam, bam.
Yeah.
Or I slap your, or I come in, slap your blade, and then try it.
You got, what, like 4 clean ones?
Maybe.
But the other thing that we found is Clark did have a lot more successful hits on me, but nearly all of them also resulted in him dying.
Yeah.
And this comes back to what we talked about before. If somebody really wants to hit you and they don't care if they're going to die, it is very, very hard to defend against that person. So a suicidal attacker who doesn't care about dying is going to be really tough to deal with, whether they have one weapon or 2 weapons.
If they're willing to die to kill you, you'll die every time.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really good, you might be able to lock them out. But if it's 2 weapons, it's so hard.
Yeah.
So when I was fencing against Clark, I was being very cautious. I was very much treating this as I don't want to die, and so I didn't take a lot of opportunities. You'll see in the footage that I was very cautious, trying to stay back, trying to find the perfect opening, and I ate it a lot because, I mean, he would seize the boar. He would come in and be aggressive, and he would take my blades out and get me. You were more aggressive with 2 of them.
I think in my theory was if I wait to try and catch or respond to you, you would have enough time to work the indes.
And I did most times.
And it's just, there was no real point. The biggest thing this can give you is I can attack here to take the blade, and then that opens up. I found it wasn't very much like at the same time. It was very much I'd move it once I caught it, and I could engage the whole body into this cut. I'd follow up with it afterwards.
Honestly, I don't think you took my sword. I don't think you successfully took or blocked my sword when I was doing a structured cut. I think it was only thrusts.
I
think when I was at long point, you caught me, or when I was thrusting.
It was always if I would cut into your sword. Every time I parried you, it would collapse. Every time I cut into your sword, it would kind of work.
Well, but you only really did that when I was thrusting.
Yeah.
You didn't do, so here's the thing that I think the takeaway is: if I were to switch to just cutting at Clark, he would have a much harder time defending, but it would leave me very open to his suicidal counterattack. Now, given that you've said that you had some success with your double model, do you think that it could form an effective style with 2 swords?
It will never be better than just the normal.
Yes. This is actually very successful against longsword. I would personally want a rapier rather than a side sword.
Yeah.
But rapier and dagger specifically versus longsword is very successful. We've done videos before where we showed that it absolutely can handle a longsword. It's not like it's going to win every time, but it's a lot. Honestly, it has a bit of an advantage if it can control the blade with the offhand. So, but that's small.
Well, what's interesting is with this, if I would parry, you usually hit
I
like here, and I'd lose.
Yeah, you don't have anything.
But
now,
if I have this one, I can.
Okay?
Yeah, I can stop this.
You can, but if I'm attacking up here, I'm not going to hit him.
Yeah.
So let's look at this again, actually.
Because if I'm
here, if the longsword is parrying and I attack up here, I absolutely am going to come in here, break his structure, and hit him.
Even if I try and move you out, it's not gonna.
I can just jam you there. Now I have to worry about his other hand. Now with the dagger, if I attack him straight on, I can maybe collapse him, sure, because I've got two hands. But it's a solid. I wish you had a glove on. It's a solid.
Yeah.
He's stopping me. He's actually stopping that thing that hit your hand.
And, no, you're good.
Okay, good.
And even if this didn't have a big sail guard, it'd be the same thing.
Yeah, but with this setup, he's not compromised in the other weapon. You don't have to worry about, because the longsword is honestly too long to maneuver with the other one.
I couldn't really do any.
You couldn't block and stab.
Actions.
So go back to that. So you'll see if I get close enough to him that he can block and stab, but look where his arm is. Look how far back it is. And at this point, I can do other stuff. He's really in a bad spot. Sometimes it'll work, but it's kind of an awkward situation. Now go to the other one and show the difference.
There's also a big thing about using two swords to guard. One is you can guard with one in transfer. So like the whole thing is if I have these ones, I can catch, transfer, and bind. You can't do that with these just because theoretically you could. Sure, I can catch, transfer, but there's so much more movement.
I will. You know what? Actually, I will say because the rapier generally is longer than the longsword. So my previous statement isn't entirely true. However, I think that with the rapier you would be in a better. So do your refused guard with the sword forward. Yeah. So you would be in a better position to take this and cut or thrust.
Yeah.
You'd probably be thrusting.
Yeah, probably. Thrust,
and you can thrust with the longsword, but the rapier is set up to do it a little bit better in a one-handed guard. So while this did see some success, it was almost exclusively in actions that doubled.
Everything that it did well, it worked well because of the fundamentals of how two-weapon fighting works, and it didn't work better than just using these.
Yeah, it was a worse version of rapier and dagger, or double stick, or double short sword, or any of the other proven methods of double weapon fighting that have smaller weapons or a longer weapon with a smaller offhand that we've seen throughout history. There's a reason this wasn't used.
It's almost like if you take a sword design for two hands, put it in one hand,
it doesn't.
It's not as good as the sword with one hand designed for one.
There is a caveat here because technically long swords are supposed to be hand and a halves.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't use a long sword. In the other hand, I would use a shield. Let me get a shield.
And even then, if you did have a longsword is a one-handed, if you could use it one-handed, it's still not going to be superior to a one-handed sword in one hand. One hand and a half sword in one hand will still be worse.
This isn't a very good shield, but it'll work. So if I had a bigger shield, you'd imagine, but I can have passive cover.
Yeah.
He's got to get through this, and on this side, I can stab around, I can do all this kind of stuff, I can actually get around, because this is much bigger. With that sword, with the long sword, so much of your hand and arm are exposed, you have to actively be seeking the blade, actively be seeking safety. With this, I just stick it in front of my body, and if it was a bigger shield, even he can't get through it. I've got this walled off, and I can use this to cover myself coming in and get him. So long sword in one hand and shield in the other hand is a very viable way to fight. I would probably want a short sword. Or an arming sword.
Yeah.
But they actually, I mean, it's historical.
Yeah.
I mean, especially, so you have to look at
Historical swords were also
smaller,
shorter in length and in hilt.
So the time at which this would have actually been used on the battlefield is more Fiore's time.
Yeah.
And at that rate, the sword would have probably been about this long. The hilt might have stopped right about here. And so it would be a lot shorter. That's more historical. These are what would you say, Meyer?
These were made for sport.
Sport.
And so at that point,
no, they did have longer long swords that were actually used for combat.
Yeah.
They were just a later period thing.
It's also just these being really long doesn't bother us because we don't carry them.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Because I mean this is gonna bump into everything. But then they have the pictures of like they were mostly carrying them up here anyway.
Yeah, but
so a lot of caveats to consider here. However, I think at the end of the day we've not necessarily conclusively, but a pretty strong case for the point that two-handed swords in each hand, two long swords, are not the best idea. And if you want to dual wield, you should do it with two shorter swords or a longer sword and a short sword. So, thanks for watching. Ah!